Good evening, everybody. A warm welcome from Ruk Rakaganno. I am Dushi Pereira. This fourth in a series of talks which Ruk Rakaganno has been hosting in the last 4 to 5 months. And this evening, we are indeed privileged to felicitate our founder, Kalakirti Iranganie Serasinghe. And to do that, we have the renowned architect, Channa Daswatte. So we are really indeed honored, privileged to welcome you both. Firstly, I would like to kick off the interview with a question of my own to Kalakirti Iranganie. In the mid-70s, when you did form Ruk Rakaganno, you were the queen of the silver screen, and indeed the sweetheart of the silver screen, even now. Your childhood was in Mudugomua, in Royal Valley, a tranquil village setting. So, which really did spark off your interest and your vision to start Ruk Rakaganno? What sparked off Ruk Rakaganno, the formation of Ruk Rakaganno?
I think she couldn't hear very well. You want to know what sparked off the formation of Ruk Rakaganno?
Oh, should I answer?
Yes, yes.
Well, when I went around in Sri Lanka, especially out into the wilderness areas, I found people cutting trees by the dozens. Huge big trees were just being felled. And when I asked them why they're felling all these trees, they said it is to grow vegetables. And I thought this is a terrible, terrible thing to do, because the felling of these forests is just no good for the environment. So I just came back, and I was a member of the Wildlife Society. So when I told people about the Wildlife Society, they were not very interested because they didn't want to save wildlife either. Wildlife was the enemy. So I came back and I told the wildlife people, look, I think we ought to change the name of the society. Later on, of course, they changed the name of the society to Wildlife and Nature Protection Society. And I said, people are not very happy when you talk about wildlife. So let's form a society to protect the trees, the environment. They will understand about trees. They know how important trees are. Not very well, but they do know certain amount. And so that is how Ruk Rakaganno was formed.
Thank you, Iranganie. We are privileged to have Channa, as I said before. And Channa, I know that you have lots of questions for Iranganie. Why don't you start off yourself?
You find a lot of noise in the background because there's a massive thunderstorm that's brewed up next to my house. But I do hope, Iranganie, you can hear me. Wonderful to have you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Oh, excellent. So Dushi asked you about the formation of Ruk Rakaganno. Can you tell us a little bit more about the other people who are involved? We know your sister is very much part of it. So can you mention some of the others who might have been part of it, who gave you the strength?
Yes, well, Ruk Rakaganno was formed when I was working at the Times of Ceylon. And the Times of Ceylon, downstairs, I was upstairs. Downstairs was the Studio Times. And that was run by Nihal Fernando, the wildlife photographer. And I was very, very happy to go and speak to him because I found that he and I absolutely agreed about the environment and, about trees and the earth and the sun and everything. so we, and Nihal was working also with his partner, Pat Decker. Pat was also a very good wildlife photographer.
The Sri Lankan lady.
He was very interested in forming a society. So we thought of a name for the society, and I said, Ruk Rakaganno. And Pat, who didn't know much Sinhala, said, what is Ruk? So I had to tell him that Ruk meant trees. It was so sweet. And so our first members were Nihal and Pat.
You're on mute. Channa, you're on mute.
Who were the others who pushed you along?
Yes, then later on, of course, we had Lucky Senanayaka, then Veer Dimel, of course, Veer and Cynthia and the daughter.
And what were your major challenges? I mean, I remember you speaking about some trees in front of St. Bridget's. So what were your early challenges? Where did it all start?
We started really, I must say,
Okay.
yes, because I had an aunt who was quite a character. She was, even in the far off days, she was a correspondent for one of the English newspapers. And when she came home, my family used to be screaming with laughter because of all the things she said. And she was really very welcome in the house. So we also understand what she said. Then one day they locked the door so that we could hear what she said, because some of her jokes were a little bit naughty. And they thought one day instantly upside and day into night. Oh, I didn't know what the devil this meant. Ordinances. I didn't understand. So in the morning,
doesn't matter, but they are going to talk to her. Doesn't matter. Go ahead. Can't you hear them talking? I went straight into them.
Somebody needs to mute.
Now, click on that link. Click on that link that I sent.
Is that
you.
Menika speaking?
I shall mute everyone.
Yeah,
Can you
you
mute?
join in the top.
Yeah, now I you need to unmute yourself.
Right.
Yes, okay.
Yes, and so you were saying about Aunt Florrie and how you see what you were saying.
Yes, so I heard Aunt Florrie say, we have changed the ordinances of nature upside down. We have changed night into day and day into night. Oh, I didn't know what the devil this ordinances were. Early morning, I ran to the dictionary and tried to look it up, and I found it was a law. It meant laws of nature. And what is this turning upside down? And well, from that day, I've been thinking about that, you see. And so when I grew up a little bit more and could understand a little bit more, I discovered what she said was absolutely true.
Indeed.
I think she's the one who really launched it.
Where was your first campaign with Ruk Rakaganno? What was your first campaign?
The first big campaign, of course, was Singaraj. They were cutting it down to make plywood. And I went to Mrs. Sirma Bandaranayaka and I explained to her why that they should stop cutting this. And she listened to me very carefully. George Rajapaksa was also seated with, can't we stop this cutting? And he said, I don't know, madam, they've gone rather fine, the agreements. So I don't know whether you'll succeed. Well, we succeeded in certain things which we thought we wouldn't succeed. Let me see if we can do this also. And she tried, I know she tried. She told me that she'll try. And she tried. But she told me, I'm sorry, I can't do it because of various other commitments that people have, governments have had. So it was then J.R. Jayawardena became the president of Sri Lanka. And I went to him, not that I did, but society was at home. Went to J.R. Jayawardena and told him, can you please stop the cutting of the Singaraja forest? And he said, why? And we explained the thing about rainforests and species and, all the rainfall and all kinds of things. We explained the whole thing to him. And he was very interested. And he said, look, I can understand, and I certainly will try to stop it. But he said, will you please write it all down? Because I don't know everything about this. So please write it down and give it to me. So that night we sat down and wrote the whole thing down about the Singaraja and why it was very important as a forest. When he read it, he said, yes, I will try to stop it at once. And he did. He completed the rain. Raise your voice a bit. And he did stop it. He actually stopped it. Wonderful.
Channa, you're muted.
One of the campaigns I remember was also part of the campaign against the Kandalama Hotel. Now, I was a part
Against Kandalama. He's asking about the campaign against Kandalama.
Campaign against the Kandalama. And I know you're a friend of Jeffrey's as well. And since I'm going to talk about his garden, I thought you had particular views about why something like that shouldn't happen.
Yes, because of the whole waterway there. And the whole village depended on that waterway. And in the time of the similar things, when there was a waterway like that, nobody was allowed to build anything. Even the villages themselves were not allowed to build their houses right close to this waterway. There was a certain distance they had to keep, and their toilets had to be at a certain place. So they were very particular about where the villagers should live and protecting this waterway. So when they wanted to build a hotel near this wonderful waterway, we thought this was a bad thing. This was not very environmentally sound at all.
Can you all hear? Because the rain here is quite.
We can hear you.
I can hear. Yes, I remember you coming to our office and sitting with Jeffrey and having this long conversation. And I must say, thanks to people like you, where the whole attitude to building hotels and what hotels should be doing to the environment has changed. Today, we don't think twice before thinking about the environment when we build. The other day, you mentioned something about how you tried to prevent the last ebony tree in Colombo being cut down. Can you tell us something about that? Much to the embarrassment of your children on their way to school.
Yes, well, the ebony trees have been planted by the British along the pavement, just outside St. Bridget's Convent. And I think these trees were attracting various animals, and they were, one or two of them had fallen down and so on. And the children used to be all the time running along the pavement and pulling these trees and so on. The Mother Superior of the temple just wanted to cut down the trees, cut them all off, because she thought that the children will get injured by trying to dance about with the trees. So she was wanted to cut them down. And I went to the Mother Superior and I said, would you let us do the cutting, please? And she said, all right, I don't mind who cuts it, so long as they're cut. So the municipality wanted to cut it down. And they wanted to cut the whole thing down right to the bottom and not allow it to sprout up again. And they were very much against us having anything to do with the trees. So we had a little bit of a battle with the municipality, and we said there's a way of cutting trees, and how we should do it and so on. And they said, oh, you are the only one who knows how to cut trees, and they went at us. And actually, we were even the newspapers were having a laugh at us, women dancing about around the trees. And the one newspaper called me in Sinhala, Ita Hunda Ammandi, Mitarama Budding. I think you understand that, don't you?
Oh, in other words, calling you something terrible.
On the radio tonight.
Note, it's absolutely lovely talking to you, Iranganie. I think we should meet again for a longer chat when all of this is over and we can meet. It's been wonderful to have you, and it's a great privilege to be able to make this felicitation.
Thanking you.
It's a privilege to make this felicitation lecture on your behalf and about a different aspect of your friend's garden. So I'll start the lecture in a little bit. I hope you listen into it, and we can share some of my thoughts about the tree and Flora of Lunuganga. Thank you so much. So lovely to talk to you, and it's been a privilege.
Dushi, you are muted.
Okay, am I okay? Sorry.
Yes, we can hear you.
Right. So thank you, Kara Surya Iranganie, for that wonderful reminiscences of Ruk Rakaganno and the formation. I think indeed the listeners would have been thrilled to hear you and see you in person, so to speak. Talking about an ebony tree, there's still one ebony tree at the cathedral down about the Lokamawata, Channa and Iranganie. It's next to the tennis courts, and it's really raised its price in gold, the tree there. So we have today Channa Daswatte as our guest speaker, talking about the Flora of Lunuganga. And as listeners would surely know, Lunuganga was Baba's country estate. Just to introduce Channa, Channa graduated in 1991 and joined the architectural consultancy of Jeffrey Baba. In fact, we might call him a prodigy of Jeffrey Baba. And in 1998, founded his own partnership with Murad Ismail, the MICD partnership. He has been in architectural education since 1992, teaching at both the City School of Architecture and the University of Moratuwa, and continues to be a visiting examiner at both institutions. Channa has authored several books, including Sri Lanka Style with Dominic Sanzoni and Colonial Furniture in the Jeffrey Baba collection. From 15 to 2019, he had the post of chairman of the Gaul Heritage Foundation. He is now chairman of the Jeffrey Bawa and Lunuganga Trust. And very appropriately, we have invited him to speak about the Flora of Lunuganga. So Channa, a warm welcome to you. Thank you for your time to speak to our listeners and promote the work Ruk Rakaganno is doing. So without much ado, Channa, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Good evening, listeners, wherever you might be. I am sort of in the middle of a massive thunderstorm, so you might have to excuse some of the noise in the background. I will now share my screen because I'm going to show you some imagery, of course, along with my conversation. The reason I selected the topic this evening is because Lunuganga, which was Jeffrey Bawa's sort of life's testament, as it were, which he worked on from 1947 until his illness, final illness in 1997. It was also the place where he kind of did various things which eventually inspired him to do a lot of the wonderful buildings that he actually built. I will take a moment to share screen. That I think is what I need to share. Share screen, and I will do the slideshow. And of course, in making the gardens, he had experimented with both building and planting ideas that went on to inspire some of the most wonderful buildings that he built through his long career. Jeffrey Bawa says in his writing that Lunuganga was part of a greater garden that is Sri Lanka. Looking at the landscape of Sri Lanka, we clearly see that what appears to be the hand of nature is in fact the hand of man. The Sri Lankan landscape is a vast manicured affair, creating a series of vistas and one passes through it. All this has arisen by the use of the landscape and the harnessing of its potential for the purposes of agriculture and animal husbandry, and of course, leaving large areas for the natural fauna to also exist and coexist amongst us. And that was really something that we always did. So if you look at the landscape of Sri Lanka, it's absolutely gorgeous. It could be a manicured garden anywhere in the world without even trying. And you also have this wonderful sort of handwork about the landscape, the wonderful paddy terraces, and so on that most people built to cultivate their fields. These are wonderful fields that you find in the hills. And similarly, Bawa suggests that his landscape was in fact something that was an extension of what he had. The naturalistic landscape of Lunuganga was in fact a highly manicured setup, which required the work of 12 gardeners to keep in good condition and needs to be kept all the time and in constant trimming and clipping and sweeping as and when the season demands it. These aerial photographs by Dominic Sansoni, taken a few years ago, shows the garden as it is in terms of what I'm going to talk to you about. It actually consists of a whole lot of trees, which sometimes goes unnoticed when we visit it as a piece of architecture. Jeffrey Bawa's Lunuganga uses his trees to, in many ways, to define the spaces in his garden, just like he would have used brick and mortar in any one of his other buildings. Indeed, many of his works, like the Ina de Silva house, where he uses this fabulous tree in the center of the garden to define the space and to perhaps add character to the space. He does the same at this early photograph of the Triton Hotel, now the Heritage Ahungala, where he uses this wonderful row of coconut trees to direct the eye towards the entrance of the hotel. So the trees become a part of the language, part of the material, which he uses to engage with the building and engage with the users of the space. At the Kandalama Hotel, the now much sort of spoken of Kandalama Hotel. Again, he uses the trees and the environment to make it a part of an extraordinary sequence of spaces that the users feel and use as they move through the landscape. The architecture of the gardens, of course, has been spoken and written about. And here I'm going to take you on a whistle-stop tour of some of the key locations in these beautiful photographs taken by Dominic Sansoni. And anyone visiting the garden never ceases to be impressed by what it is. I'm deliberately showing you black and white photographs that Dominic really likes taking of the place, because this is really a story about light and shade and the spaces that you see. And these are some of those wonderful spaces that is Lunuganga. And all of it sort of comes together in concert to define spaces that you move through and that you're expected to look through and engage with. I'm taking you through this just so that it reminds you of the place before I go into the detail of what makes up this garden. What we are looking at is the architecture of the garden, and then of course what I'm trying to talk about eventually is what it's really made up. This early drawing by Lucky Senanayake of the garden shows the initial moves of forming the key spaces from the woodland landscape. That was an original rubber plantation that had been overgrown. And then Geoffrey Barber allows it to take on a natural regeneration. It is also clear from the drawing that more effort has been taken to draw certain trees more clearly. And obviously that's something that was deliberate because the trees were special. The flora of Lunuganga beyond the buildings makes a key component of making the spaces of that garden. The flora plays two roles in the garden. One, the flora that is sort of a palimpsest from which the spaces have been carved out, with the flora being the visual boundaries of the spaces. And the second flora, types of flora, is where flora is used as a marker or a focal point. It's almost like as though the tree itself becomes a monument in certain instances in the garden. If you think about the flora as palimpsest for carving out the spaces, you see the first aspect of the vegetation of Lunuganga is to see that Geoffrey Barber has been very particular about the kinds of plants he has allowed to be used as his palimpsest. In fact, the original property was a rubber plantation, and rubber trees are quite closely planted. And it allowed him to carve the spaces, as it were, out of it. The rest, of course, over the years, is what came as natural vegetation in that area and a natural regeneration of that rubber plant. And if you look very closely, as we have occasionally, and in fact, in a project that was supported by Geoffrey in the 1990s, a gentleman called Vimal Lokuliyana, of course, one of Shirani Balasuriya's students, did a study of some of these plants. And I'm going to take you through some of these plants that we sometimes don't see as we pass through the gardens. We admire the beauty, the views, the vistas, but you often don't see the building blocks of this garden, which is actually a whole series of extraordinary trees. Some of them pretty rare because, number one, we aren't even able to identify it. Looking at this aspect of the vegetation of Lunuganga, we begin to see that it's just walls of planting that is almost like architectural walls that you see around the garden. They come to the edges of the lawns, and then beyond that is forest, which is often a massive wall. Now, what does all of this mass of vegetation consist of? Very few of us take notice of it, but in fact, it's an extraordinary series of plants, some rare and some not. And I just want to make you observe very clearly some of these plants that make up this magnificent greenery that becomes the backdrop to the spaces at Lunuganga. So some of the plants, I mean, what I've done in these few slides is to take photographs of the plants, most taken at Lunuganga in the center, and botanical drawings, some of them by Vimal Lokulena, others by a recent student of the landscape course, Sana Thera, and others, of course, taken off the internet to give you a recognition of them. So, for instance, you have Davata, Adavaka, Bombu, and Ankenda, plants that we kind of remember from hearing because someone spoke about it as some medicine, or because someone said that that was a Hadavaka plant, or others from our childhood as we grew up in, if we grew up in a village, we might have heard of these things. Davata, certainly, we still have Davata plants in some of our gardens in suburban Colombo. But at Lunuganga, you hardly notice them because they become a part of the background to the spaces. There's, of course, kahata trees, which I didn't know existed there, but there was a kahata tree. And quite a lot of Havarinuga, or Guinea kurugas, as Mr. Bava used to call them, because apparently it was an introduced species that was brought into Sri Lanka. But of course, today it's used as a great timber. But Havarinuga is these long, tall, rather beautiful plants with seeds that look like the wigs that ladies in Sri Lanka used to make out of their sort of hair that went off their hair. And then, of course, there are the Munamau, Goraka trees. There's the Waldel, Artocarpus nobilis, a magnificent endemic of Sri Lanka. The Cinnamonium zelanicum, which becomes a part of that whole area. The Kina trees, which we often sort of think, oh, what's that sort of wild plant? But we hardly know what it is. So there are the Kina trees. And there's, of course, the Nadun trees, jack trees, the occasional tulip tree, and of course, the absolutely beautiful Diapara, Godapara, as opposed to the Diapara, which of course is a very, very common plant at Lunuganga and used for the edging of a lot of these forests, as a sort of, because the Diapara regenerates rather quickly and is used on the edges of the lawns by Bawa to kind of give a clear edging. There's the Valiata, the Divikaduru, and a whole lot of others. Of course, some of these plants in the making of the spaces sometimes tend to stand out clearly. Now, in this case, right by the pavilion that is there for the water trough pavilion on the Cinnamon Hill, there are these two extraordinarily beautiful Davata trees. Now, Davata is a very interesting tree in my mind because it is said that it's sort of millions of years ago, a tree that was originally a mangrove, but may have migrated back to land. And you still see the kind of stilt roots that it might have had as a mangrove at the base of these wonderful trees. So these two trees are classic examples of Davatas that you see. And of course, there are two tiny little arecanut trees that you see in the background of this particular image. Not very far from it are these two very beautiful Godapara trees. Godapara is a very interesting endemic as well. This particular subspecies endemic to Sri Lanka with these beautiful white flowers when in season. And of course, the national tree, the Na tree. Again, pushed back to the background. It's not planted as a great specimen tree, but because of the nature of the plant, it becomes almost a specimen in one of the walls of vegetation that make up one of the spaces at Lunuganga. There's even a jacaranda at one of the ends of the lawns, a jacaranda plant from Brazil, and of course the kiripalu. But kiripalu, of course, is found almost everywhere in this mass of vegetation, but this particular kiripalu tree is on the edge of the topmost lawn, and you look down on it from one of the verandas of the main house. So there's a whole series of these wonderful trees, including this bamboo and this divikadru that's part of an ensemble on the upper terrace of Lunuganga. So you find that the vegetation of Lunuganga that we see as these walls of vegetation are in fact more than walls. They consist of a whole lot of trees, and I'm only mentioning a small amount of trees. But if you look at a typical scene at Lunuganga, and this one looking from the Cinnamon Hill back at the main house, you see all these different trees that I have indicated on the right-hand side of the slide. So you will see Spatodias, you will see Muruta, there's Ankenda, there's Kos, there's Aralia, there's a whole lot of wonderful trees that you will begin to identify in this one scene. And I am not even going into what is in the shrubbery in the foreground. So while one engages with the main space, the great vista that gives us so much pleasure, we must understand that giving us that pleasure is possible only because of this incredible variety of trees that come to form the architecture of the garden. Along the water's edge of the plant species begin to differ, and this mass of vegetation mostly consists of plants that tolerate high water tables and are mostly mangroves. The majority of the mangroves are Kadol and Kerala, with some freshwater pandanus thrown in, along with Godakadaru that inhabits the highlands on the edges. And there's also a few Godamidalla and the occasional Madan trees that are on the edges of the waterways. Now, this is typically part of the lower garden. And if you once again look at this, it's full of these kinds of plants. If you look at the central section, these are images taken of some of the plants that are in Lunuganga, and on the edges are botanical drawings of all of those plants. Again, the mass of vegetation, which we appreciate almost like architecture, we appreciate the space, not the walls, but the walls consist of all of this incredible variety of plants. Looking back at this image, you will find all of these plants. There's even a peltophorum on the edge of one of these marshy paddy fields that you see in that image. So if you go back to that image, the peltophorum is the right-hand corner. There's a madang. There's a whole lot of other plants that you will see that I have put in here. And again, going back to it, right on the far edge, right by the water, is gallaha, which is a kind of reed that is used to make high-quality mats in this area. And of course, the foreground, fallow at the moment, is the paddy. So you see the Oryza sativa and the gallaha, and of course, Diapara, Godapara, Madang, Peltophorum. There's a little bit of Ratmal or Ixora coccinea, the local Ixora. The pandanus, the freshwater pandanus, not the one that you find by the sea, but a freshwater pandanus that you see. And of course, Madang is all over the place. It is this core of flora and growth that forms the large majority of the planting at Lunuganga and accounts for its great biodiversity. In a birdwatching note in the guest book at Lunuganga, Ismet Rahim and Lucky Senanaika, observing the birds, had recorded almost 50 species of birds in the garden. So in many ways, this rubber plantation that Geoffrey Barber bought and transformed into this great piece of architecture is also a sort of regenerated low country rainforest. If you think of the mammals, the occasional wild boar, the mouse deer that you see in the garden, and of late on our island in Hondua, we have a herd of hog deer, which was introduced there some years ago and thriving at the moment. And in many ways, the garden is also a pretty important piece of rainforest with this great diversity of low country trees that make a part of it. So that's really the part of the garden that we pass by as we walk through and enjoy its architecture. So next time you're there, I think it's something that you need to be looking out for. Try and understand and recognize some of the flowers and the trees that make up the raw material that is the garden. And all gardens are like that. We clear up areas because we want to have space to enjoy, but often we forget that they're made up of trees that become the background to space. The other aspect of the garden is where we find that flora is used as a marker and as a specific design feature. What I've been talking about up to now was really about how it's a backdrop. But here we begin to see Geoffrey Barber was also a master at being able to create landscape objects out of the plants and the flora that we had. Within and part of the spaces created out by carving the spaces in the main landscape are placed various objects and sequences of objects that refine the experience through these spaces. These will indicate a directional movement, perhaps, a contrast of shape and color, which will have some kind of semiotic requirement for the architecture. And many of the plants used in this aspect are those that are not particularly indigenous to this part of the country. So in many ways, they stand out of the mass of vegetation that was a regenerated rainforest. So that's quite interesting as well. The juxtaposition of what might not be indigenous to a space against what has been regenerated as a rainforest or a low country forest in the garden. So the garden plays on both of these things to make what we see as the spatial experience. Of course, the most famous of all of these is this extraordinary frangipani tree that stands on the top of the northern terrace. Brumeria obtusa, I think it is called. This, interestingly, is actually two branches that originally planted together and growing away from each other. Of course, there are stories that Geoffrey Barber occasionally sort of weighted them down with rocks and so on to make it grow like this. But he was in many ways quite a master and a keen and knowledgeable gardener, because he knew that should you plant two trees together, they would always grow out away from each other. And in doing so, it has become this particular shape, this incredible shape that everybody admires as this great frangipani tree, now almost 75 years old, sitting on the top terrace of Lunuganga. And of course, this famous view also has a whole series of wonderful trees and plants that make it up, looking out from the front door. And in the middle distance, famously, the pot is placed so that your eye is taken out and you kind of see the Dagaba on top of this mountain, a sort of Japanese aspect of this landscape, which begins to borrow the outside landscape and make it part of yours. And the main feature of this scene is this particular tree that you see here, which is a Moonamal tree. And a Moonamal tree was there originally in the garden, in the forest when Geoffrey Barber cleared it, cleared the Cinnamon Hill and found it. And for many years, it stood there on top of the Cinnamon Hill. Unfortunately, in 1998, very soon after Geoffrey got his final illness, it was struck by lightning and died. What we see here is a replacement that was placed there in about 2000, so it's about 20 years old. The pot is still there, and the Moonamal, of course, is hopefully growing into the shape that we all want it to become. Other great specimen trees include this incredible Atamba tree, Mangifera zelanica, or the wall amber, as they call it, or Atta amber. It's at the entrance of Park in the old days, where you talk about additional flowering and so on. And quite close to it, you find a tree, the Nilverulu, a tree that is native to the foothills of the Himalayas and on the Indo-Gangetic plain. And it is from these Nilverulus that the Rudraksha seed is made. But what's wonderful about the way Baba has planted it is it's kind of partly hidden in the forest, and these mysterious blue fruits begin to fall on the arrival terrace. So it's quite clever to create this specimen plant, and he's only got one tree. So at the arrival, in the season, you find these beautiful blue olives that fall on it. So it's all made part of the experience of the garden. Other specimens, of course, include the sealing wax palm at the entrance, along mixed with some dotalu, and of course the ubiquitous Rhaphis excelsa. And on one side of this, just to the right, you can just about see it, is a cannonball tree, of course, called the sal in Sri Lanka, but not the original sal that you find again in the Indo-Gangetic plain. So it's interesting that both these plants come from that part of the country. The one that we have here is from Malaysia. Once again, this beautiful specimen of a Daswatte tree with this extraordinary root system, which people say dates back to a time when it was originally a mangrove plant. And of course, in the background are more of the Rhaphis excelsa, which is used by Bava quite a lot right across the garden. And clinging on to this wonderful old rubber tree from the original rubber plantation is this kadupul plant, overgrowing and really weighting down the tree. And as we look through this scene where the Rhaphis excelsa is used to line the arrival path to the main house, is this rubber tree with the kadupul, and behind it is magnificent na tree that becomes the backdrop to the whole thing. Amongst all of these plants is also a whole lot of mahogany trees that have come of their own in the garden. They have huge buttress roots at the bottom, but there are also massive trees that grow through this wilderness. And several examples of them are also on what is known as the Red Terrace, where a lot of them have grown to extraordinary sites with these magnificent buttress roots supporting them. And of course, part of that ensemble are also some na trees. And as we go further down the Red Terrace, on the top level around the house is this old mango tree, which is sort of bent with age. And right under it is an old ranavara with these beautiful yellow flowers that creates a base to the mango. And on the mango itself is a betel nut, a wild betel nut creeper growing up. And just behind it is this ebony tree that was planted by Jeffrey Bauer in the late 1980s as a tiny little plant, which was gifted to him by his office for Christmas. And we now see it growing in all its glory right next to the gallery, the art gallery that's just below it. From there, you look down into the water garden. Here, we begin to see a whole series of beautiful trees, 2 clumps of bamboo on either side of this waterway, along with two Daswatte trees that are on the edge of the water. And there's a mass of Diapara that's at the back of the black pavilion that you see, which is the eastern end of the lower part of Lunuganga. And in the foreground is a tiny little billing tree on the upper terrace, and the base on the left-hand side, you see a single cycad that is almost cultural in the way it has been placed. The middle walk starts at the end of this terrace and moves through a rich mix of the first kind of planting, thick planting, and then appears onto a grassy slope where there's a series of agave plants that have been planted there. So the middle walk starts here with a whole lot of arecanut and dotalu palms, and that then gives into a whole lot of others, which includes traveler's palms, an oil palm, which grows on, which you can see on the left-hand side of this picture, a whole lot of dotalu, Rhaphis, Alpinia, and Selaginella, of course, this beautiful blue-green fern that you find as a base to most of this planting. And you go through that, and then you come into this bank of the false staghorn fern, the agave, the big agave plant, and of course, the agave augustifolia, the tiny spiky plant that you see in many parts of this drier part of the garden. Going down from the middle walk, you come to the paddy fields, and on the edge of the paddy fields are these extraordinary group of Madang trees. These, of course, have been cut down on the top and espaliered almost by Geoffrey Bauer to have them growing low and twisted against the hillside. And they have been sort of cut and pruned in such a way that you can look over them at the water, but when you're underneath on the lower level, they become almost a canopy and an umbrella. Of course, this is not natural growth. They have been carefully cut and twisted, and in many ways specimen plants or specimen trees that have been made to grow in a very specific way in the garden. And this leads to the Watergate, this sort of checkerboard of grass and cement that you see at the edge of the water. And that is simply a group of Madang and Godakaduru. The Godakaduru for its straight, pale skin, pale bark, and of course the wonderfully twisted Madang that you find almost leaning against the ground as it manages to just come out and raise its head above the checkerboard of grass and concrete. Looking back as you start making your way, wending your way back to the upper part of the garden, you see this wonderful frangipani tree, and you can see why it has been used. Because the pale skin, the pale bark, creates a fantastic contrast against the darkness of the local vegetation. And you can see how cleverly Baba has used that plant to reflect in the water and to see it as you go along. So of course, this scene consists of these three plants, the Diapara, Madang, and Aralia. And just off to the right of the picture, you would have seen a Godamidala with its beautiful pink flowers in season, becoming a part of the lower garden by the water, with the mass of vegetation by the water of plants that like more wet feet. Of course, I'm kind of running out of time. I think we're supposed to finish at 7 o'clock. So I'll kind of take you in many ways, the garden at Lunuganga, and what I'm trying to make out of this very short conversation about it, is that the garden at Lunuganga appears to be rather natural. But in fact, it's a highly manicured process, just like the garden of Sri Lanka. It's highly manicured, it's got to be carefully tended, and we begin to see that it's in keeping the manicuring of this garden that allows a lot of the spaces to be kept as they are. But in the background of it all is this regenerated rainforest. So you see that the regenerated rainforest plays against the manicured and twisted and turned trees to create the spaces that makes up Lunuganga. And it is the careful positioning and cultivation and perhaps even manicuring and manipulating these trees that makes up the most interesting part of the garden. But one can't actually survive or be of any meaning without the other. So in many ways, this also sort of exposes to us the fact that Geoffrey Bauer was a highly skilled gardener, and he had a keen understanding what was possible to do with trees. Sometimes he let them alone and let them simply grow. So in many ways, the forest that you see in Lunuganga was never planted by him. It was a regeneration. But sometimes, and if you really look at the kind of books that he read in his pre-architecture time, you find that he had a whole lot of books about gardening. And he knew exactly how to manipulate and manicure and make a garden out of nothing, virtually, and how to deal with trees as it went along. And it really wasn't a sort of, just making of a garden. He set out to make a great garden and not just simply to make a piece of architecture, but to make a great garden because he knew what trees were about. He likes to say that it all just came about as though it was, just a weekend pastime. It certainly wasn't a weekend pastime, Bava set out to make a great garden using the flora of the region he was working in, the trees and plants of wet zone Sri Lanka as his material at hand, and with a knowledge of the subject of gardening. Even though he rather casually once commented that all he was trying to do was to try and recreate a semblance of some of the atmospheric gardens that he enjoyed in his roots in Britain and Italy. So thank you very much for listening to me. I think I've kind of come to the end of my time. You might ask me a few questions later on about my thoughts about the trees and flora of Lunuganga.
Thank you very much, Channa.
Beginning. So first of all, Simon has asked, how many gardeners are employed at Lunuganga?
Well, Lunuganga is interesting because when Jeffrey was there, when Jeffrey Bava was there, he employed only 4 gardeners. And that's because I think he continued to develop and process the garden. So he would sort of allow sections of the garden to grow up for 6 months, and then he would arrive there and then work with his gardeners to manipulate, to twist and turn and cut and shape it to his liking. Of course, now, which is the garden has been 20 years under the Lunuganga Trust, it is expected that the garden looks spectacular and beautiful at all times. So we now have to employ 10 gardeners as opposed to the 4 Jeffrey used. It's we have 10, 4 of them are, 3 of them are actually from his time and are very well versed in the nature of the garden. And the others, of course, have come in recently. And it's a continuous process to make sure that every part of the garden looks as best as possible, because we don't have the privilege of Jeffrey Bava changing it as he went along.
And what extent, Channa?
Well, the garden itself is 16 acres, but of course we now look after much larger areas. The trust has sort of engaged with the islands that we own, the Dedua, the 2 islands on the lake, and we have also acquired more land as we went along. So there's a little bit more, but the formal garden that we walk through is 16 acres.
Aisha?
So Kanchana, or perhaps Kanchana, has asked, is there any trimming taking place to maintain the vegetation, or do you just let it be like that? And if so, how often do you trim it?
Well, there's a lot of trimming going on all the time, because as I said, Jeffrey was a keen gardener, and his influence was mostly from the British gardening tradition. And in the British gardening tradition, you have so many methods by which you twist and turn trees and make sure you trim them and so on. So as I said earlier in my conversation, there are 2 sides to the garden. There's the garden that is allowed to simply grow as a forest. And that's the backdrop, the backbone of the garden, the backdrop to the spaces. And then you have the specific trees that have to look exactly like that all the time. So you do have to continuously trim it, trim some of those to make sure it remains. So yes, I mean, the 10 gardeners have full-time work every day. The major trimming happens under supervision, often by me or others who are familiar with the garden, and often our garden manager. And of course, it's a continuous process.
Ravi has made the comment that this place looks perfect for forest bathing.
Well, I think it's hugely popular with when it was all open with Japanese visitors, because it really was what it is, and particularly some parts of it where the insides of the forest, not so much the garden per se, but if you walk into those large areas that have been allowed to be regenerated. And I made a recent walk on one of our islands, which of course we don't have visitors on yet. It's a fabulous place for forest bathing.
Thank you, Channa. Vicky has asked how to make the right decision on what kind of trees to be considered and their location.
That's a difficult question, because it depends on the garden you want to make. Of course, my personal way of gardening is a bit similar to Jeffrey Bava. You allow the natural trees and plants to simply grow. For instance, the garden of the house that I'm in at the moment, you might have seen a little bit of it at the back when we started this conversation. It's just simply allowing the vegetation that grows in Corte area to simply take over. I don't even know some of the names of the trees and plants that in my garden. And then you begin to say, well, I want a focal point here. And what is the best tree that you can manipulate to your shape and form? And that's what you do, I think. So I mean, things like Aralia and so on are easy to manipulate. And as I said, the pale color of the bark helps to become a sort of contrast to a background of darkness and so on. So you play with that. There are some trees easier to manipulate than others. And of course, and as a background, it's always good to have plants that you don't have to bother about. You just allow them to grow naturally. And that becomes the backdrop to any garden design.
Jane has asked, was Jeffrey influenced by his brother Bevis in creating his gardens?
They had two very, very, very different views of what a garden might be, as you can see from the two gardens. Definitely, yes. I mean, Jeffrey writes in his book, Lunuganga, that it was he owes his garden to his brother because when he came back from England after studying architecture, or in fact, before he started doing architecture, he stayed with his brother, and it was his brother's garden that inspired him to make one of his own. Of course, they had two totally different styles and views of gardening. Bevis a more intimate, inward-looking kind of garden with interesting little nooks and corners to enjoy. And Jeffrey is a far more sweeping, outward-looking garden. In many ways, they kind of, I think, they complemented each other. Jeffrey was a very private, very inward person making an outward garden. And Bevis, I think, from what I know of him, was a much more open and sort of with a lot of joy there, but he had a much more inward-looking garden. So it's quite interesting, the two brothers and their two gardens.
And Ninel has asked, will Ruk Rakaganno and Bawa Trust be able to organize a landscape tree-oriented tour of Lunuganga once it's safer to travel, please?
We are working towards that. We certainly, I mean, obviously, we would like to do that. In fact, there is a project that Jeffrey Bawa had started. The trustees are seriously considering that we do it at some point, that we do a mapping of the garden with all its trees. Now, so the lovely sort of, some of the lovely drawings you saw in my show, in my lecture, were from Vimal Lokuliana, who was a student of Shirani Balasuriya's. She recommended him to us, and Jeffrey commissioned him to paint the indigenous trees of Lunuganga. And he had painted 23 or 24 of them. And we know there's many more. So it's a very, very interesting thought. And I think we will definitely work towards that. And I think for more of our visitors to understand what makes up Lunuganga would also be another layer of knowledge and interest.
So related to that, Kanchana has asked, is there a plant nursery based on Lunuganga species?
At the moment, our curatorial team has 4 plants that are for sale. So if you go to the Lunuganga shop online, you will find that there are 4 plants that are available for sale. And there are specific plants that grow in Lunuganga. And having looked at all the drawings that were done by Vimal, I'm even more inspired to push my team to start planting them, because recently I've been trying to make to plant a forest in my own estate up in Kandy, and it's very difficult to find indigenous species. I mean, you go to even the forest department, it's difficult to find indigenous species. So in many ways, Lunuganga can play a role, I think, in doing that. So yes, I will tell my team. But at the moment, there are 4 species. I can't remember what they are. But if you go to the Lunuganga shop, the Lunuganga site shop online, you can actually order the trees, and they will either be delivered to you or you can collect them from the Colombo office.
Channa Dharaka has asked, sir, what was architect Jeffrey Bawa's big idea or the concept when composing the flora in Lunuganga?
Well, that's a very complicated question. I think I'll need to give an architecture lecture on that. But I think essentially it was really about, as I said, as he said, it was about recreating a sort of atmosphere of the great gardens of Europe that he had enjoyed. So you begin to see that in those gardens, it engages with the landscape that is around it. And conceptually, you're making those connections to the landscape that is around. So, for instance, the great sweeping view with the pot in the middle distance and looking out to the stupa is one of those classic moments when Jeffrey Baba opens out his garden to connect with the landscape outside.
Okay, I think we've covered all of the questions. There are several comments. Ravi has said, these photographs are amazing and the info is very detailed, love them. And there's a lot of people who have appreciated your talk in the chat. I hope you check out those comments as well. Thank you so much, Channa.
Thank you, Channa. So before I get on to the next item of the agenda, two questions from me. One is the lawn from architectural point of view. It's the front lawn next to the building. It's in squares. What is the effect of that?
Sorry,
concrete squares on the lawn.
Yes, yes.
Why? What's the perception of that?
Well, the concrete squares that I spoke about is at something called the Watergate, and it is where the boats go out into the lake from. So in many ways, the squares just simply begin to define the place where the boats come out, and that contrast of grass and cement gives you, it's almost like the deck on which the boats can land. And then that contrasts against the natural twists and turns of the trees, which kind of highlights the beauty of the tree, because the geometry against nature, if you think about a lot of our architecture, our ancient architecture, look at Sigiriya, for instance, you find the natural landscape and you have the straight line that begins to almost highlight the beauty of nature by the hand of man. So in many ways, what Jeffrey does at the garden is that he just puts a tiny little line of something, either a little grid of squares or a little low wall somewhere that defines the hand of man, that gives you that kind of proportion or that kind of connection to the natural landscape.
Okay, done. And finally, on a personal note, what is the biggest impact of Baba's design had on you?
Oh my goodness. It's very difficult not to...
One single impact perception.
The single impact is to kind of, for me, is that in my work, it's never sort of, never rest on your laurels. Basically, he was always willing to experiment. And that may have come from his gardening background. He was always willing to experiment and get into something new. And he'd try never to repeat himself in all of his work. So a new challenge was always what he wanted. And I enjoy that as well. I can not in any other way.
Thank you very much, Channa. It was really informative and educative from my point of view. So Aisha, our next item on the agenda would be the tributes for Iranganie from her grandsons who are in Melbourne, I believe, Australia, and quite late at night. So over to them now.
Suramba and Ansuman, right? If I can ask you to switch on your videos, please. Or will you be delivering a verbal tribute? I think. Hi, we have.
Yeah, I was under the impression that my brother would be going first, but yeah. Yeah, so my grandmother, can she hear me?
Yes, she can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, so she's someone who's actually had quite a significant influence on my values and my upbringing. I don't know if she's aware of this, but yeah, a lot of the way I approach life and other people is actually derived from her approaches to these things, and it's really had a very positive impact on my personality, in my opinion. Her sort of non-aggressive sort of approach everything has been quite, I mean, I don't know anyone else who's as sincere to life and other people and other beings as my grandmother is. And she's quite a unique and special person. And she's actually like a big role model for me in that aspect. I remember, I don't think she remembers this, but it was my brother and I used to fight quite a lot when we were younger. And I remember this was in our house in when we used to live in Nugegoda, and me and my brother were fighting, and it wasn't a big fight. I mean, it was physical, and I think most grandparents would have, shouted at us or something, told us to stop and, screamed at us or hit us or something like that. But she just burst into tears. She was so upset that we were fighting, and it like affected her so much and it upset her. And we kind of both just stopped in our tracks. Like we just stopped fighting. And that's something that kind of stayed with me and like really affected me and made me a much less of a violent person. And whenever I would get angry or something like that, what her acts and her values would always kind of come at the back of my mind. And yeah, that's just something special about her that really influenced me. And I'm very grateful to have a person like that in my life. So, yeah.
Thank you, Ansuman.
Thank you, Ansuman. Yeah. Suramba, yes.
Hi, yeah. So, yeah, very similarly, when I was younger, you don't really realize obviously you're a kid, so you don't realize the values that are being instilled in you. It's only as you get older and you grow up and go out into the world and you become an adult, you kind of start to understand the values that were instilled in you, the qualities and how they impact your day-to-day decision making and how you deal with situations and people and relationships. And I only find myself really appreciating it now, older. Yeah, and when I was younger, I used to have quite a bit of a temper growing up. And I like to think I've worked on it now and I'm better at it. But it used to always amaze me how patient and caring and empathetic my grandmother, or Kato as my brother and I call her. She's one of the most innocent and kindest people I know, and that always inspired me to be better and be more compassionate and try to hold my anger back whenever I feel myself getting volatile. And I think it's helped a lot. And I don't think she's aware of this because I don't think I've expressed it before directly. So yeah, I hope you know that.
Thanks a lot, Suramba. Iranganie, you really are the queen of the silver screen at that time and still is. So thank you very much, Iranganie. We are fighting time, 7:20, 20 minutes behind schedule. So the next item, is it the vote of thanks, Aisha?
That's
yes.
right. Yes.
Just a little bit about ourselves, Ruk Rakaganno. So as the name implies, Ruk Rakaganno, we are here to preservation of trees, also of course nature. And going forward, we are hoping to continue with our bi-monthly tree talks like this one. And also a tree walk possibly when the pandemic situation eases, free walk at the Nugegoda Wetland Park. So look forward to that as well, listeners. And very importantly, we have got, actually thanks to our previous president, the late Mrs. Kamini Vitana, we got 50 acres of land from the forest department on the buffer zone of Singaraja. And we are about to sign an MOU with a funder who will help us to reforest this land, which is on a 4-year span. So I would like listeners who are non-members of Ruk Rakaganno to join us. Please send us an email and we'll send you an application form to participate in this 50-acre reforestation program. So thank you very much, everybody. It has been a pleasure to host this show, and we will continue with these free talks on a bi-monthly basis. Just to say, we had a full house of 100. Unfortunately, our Zoom account can accommodate only 100 participants, and we were knocking at the door at 100 all the time. So thank you very much for listening. Please join us if you are not a Ruk Rakaganno member. Send us an email. We'll send you the application. And good night from me and from everyone of Ruk Rakaganno. Thank you. Asha, you can put the presentation back on with the music.
Thank you very much, Channa. That was a very, very interesting evening I had. Very interesting indeed.
Thank you, Iranganie. You have graced our occasion, and all health and best wishes to you. You are our inspiration.
Thank you once again, Shirani.